Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Monica, for the introduction. Thanks to the district for inviting me to be a part of this series and to share my love of cover crops with you all. Um, so I work at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm a research scientist stationed in Palmer at the Matanuska Experiment Farm and Extension Center. And I lead a research program that really focuses on soil health and cover crops. So we have studies and trials every summer where we're evaluating cover crops and an entire research program built around that. But tonight I just want to share kind of a cover crop overview. So cover crops 101. What are they? Why do we want them? Why might we not want to grow them? And then, where to begin if you're interested in trying to grow some cover crops. So we'll go ahead and just get started with a simple definition of, what is a cover crop? And a cover crop is a plant that you intentionally plant in a space that is not occupied by a crop that, a cash crop that you're wanting to grow. So we call that bare ground fallow if it doesn't have a crop growing in it. And that could be, on the edge of a field or an empty bed. It could be because you just want to rest an area from growing a cash crop for a year. And so you intentionally plant a cover crop or a mix of different species to occupy that soil that would otherwise be bare. And, there are maybe a lot of reasons why that might seem silly. If you're not going to harvest something from a cover crop, then what's the point of growing it? And it really kind of comes down to soil health. So I'm a soil scientist, and this is the reason why I love cover crops so much, because they're a tool to really protect and feed the soil. So this little diagram here on the left-hand side of the screen is a nice graphic of what the Natural Resources Conservation Service calls their principles of soil health. So they have 4 guidelines that they recommend to follow if you really want to kind of care and tend to your soil health. And so we'll start here at the very bottom, maximizing soil cover. And cover crops can achieve this by protecting the soil surface. So just like our skin or our buildings, when they're exposed to the elements and the environment, it can be kind of degrading to the soil to be exposed to the wind, the water, the temperature fluctuations. And so one principle of soil health is to keep some kind of plant or organic material on the soil surface to protect and insulate the soil from that harsh environment. And so cover crops can achieve that. Moving on to this green wedge, the maximizing living roots. Living cover crops are a great way to bring nutrients and organic material down into the soil. It's like growing organic matter in place. And we've learned over the last few decades that the best way to improve soil health and stimulate a lot of biological activity and soil drainage and aeration is with living roots. And so this is one of the most powerful tools that we have for feeding and protecting soil, and cover crops do a really good job of maximizing the time and the space that's occupied by living roots. Moving up here to the top, minimizing disturbance. We know that disturbance, like tillage or manipulating the soil through tillage it can be kind of disruptive to the soil. And there are, different settings and scenarios where we have, it's fairly easy to have minimal disturbance gardening and farming. And then there are other farming settings where it's a little bit more challenging. And cover crops don't necessarily minimize disturbance by default, but they can do a lot of good to the soil to kind of counteract some of those negative effects of disturbance. So cover crops are kind of compatible with any kind of disturbance that happens in the soil, just as a part of the production system. And then this last principle here, maximizing biodiversity. This is a really important one that is, it's kind of rooted in the idea that diversification or crop rotation is like a fundamental principle of farming. We know that if we grow the same crop in the same place year after year after year, that crop's going to start to deplete the nutrients and the resources that it needs in that space. And it can also cause and attract and sustain disease and pest issues. So we know that it's really important to rotate different crops every year, kind of move our different species around the garden or the farm so that we can break those disease and pest cycles, and we can use different types of species and plants um, to access different nutrients in the soil, and that diversity is a really good thing. And so in situations where we don't always have the ability to rotate our cash crop, a cover crop is a way to introduce more diversity into the system, to help with that kind of rotational need. And it's not just about plant diversity and increasing the types of different plant species that are in the garden or the farm, but cover crops can also attract lots of beneficial insects like pollinators. Um, and you can also use cover crops to maybe attract little grazers like chickens, rabbits, or big grazers like cattle, sheep, and goats. And so all of those, that variety of farm critters and creatures and plants is a fundamental principle for maintaining soil health. So cover crops really play an important role in all of these, in improving, protecting, and feeding the soil. And this little image here, this photo on the right-hand side, is just a reminder. These are just some little baby alfalfa plants. As a reminder that, a lot of times all we see from the plants is what's above ground. And so we see the leaves and the shoots, and we can see that, how, and we can imagine how they could be protecting the surface of the soil, and attracting some more biodiversity into the system. But don't forget that they're attached to roots. Whoops. And those roots are really important too for meeting a lot of these soil health principles. So roots are our friends, and cover crops are a way to kind of grow those benefits in place. So cover crops feed the soil, and they protect the ground surface in between these cash crop production seasons, or in spaces that aren't hosting, a vegetable or a flower crop or something else that will be in that annual production phase. So you may hear other terms or come across other terms and related terms for the wording of cover crop. And I just wanted to introduce those in case you've come across them elsewhere, or you see them in a magazine or on a YouTube video in the future. So both the terms lay crop and catch crop are synonymous. They mean the exact same thing as a cover crop. A companion or an intercrop are cover crops that are planted right next to the cash crop rows. So maybe you have alternating rows of a cash crop, maybe a row of potatoes, and then a row of cover crops, and then another row of potatoes and another row of cover crops. And so they're integrated into that system, simultaneously growing with the cash crop, and they're considered, a companion or an intercrop in that scenario. A green manure is a cover crop that's allowed to grow for a period of time, and then it's tilled into the soil. So it can be kind of like a living mulch that's terminated through or killed through the action of tillage, and the tillage kind of breaks up that plant material and incorporates it into the soil as an organic amendment or fertilizer. And then finally, a fodder and forage crop. So this is when a cover crop is used to feed livestock or other animals, either in place. Maybe you release some animals and they peck at the living cover crop, or maybe you actually harvest it and feed it to animals somewhere else. And at that point, the cover crop is then sort of graduates into being a forage or a fodder crop. So cover crops maybe aren't always intentionally planted to get some kind of product like a forage, but sometimes they can. Sometimes we can let them grow to produce seed, or even they might have, some kind of vegetable benefit. Maybe we can harvest them and eat them for ourselves, or maybe they put on, for example, a pea pod, which you could eat or feed to animals. And so those are nice benefits, but not all cover crops necessarily offer some kind of a harvestable product. Okay, so why would we even want to consider growing a cover crop? And I should preface this by saying that whether you have a couple square feet of land that you want to use for gardening or producing food, flowers, anything, or you have tens of thousands of acres, cover crops can fit into any of those systems of any size. And it's there's no single recipe for using cover crops. And how you use them and why you use them is completely customizable for your needs. And we'll talk more about, what those might be as we go along here. So I'll list off some benefits and also some risks associated with growing the cover crops. So some of the benefits are, as I mentioned, erosion prevention. When soil is exposed to the elements, it's subject to movement by both wind and water. We experience this a lot in the Matsu, where we have really, high winds, especially in the shoulder seasons in the spring and the fall, when we might not have a lot of plant cover or snow cover to protect the soil. And so if you have a cover crop in place, it provides living cover to protect the soil, but then also after it dies, after the freezing period in the fall, its dead carcass or the residue that it leaves on the surface can also hold that soil in place through those harsh winter and spring months. I already mentioned that roots do a lot of good to the soil, and cover crop roots can break through compacted soil and provide little channels and pores and pathways for water and air to move in and out of the soil. And so if you have soil that's really compacted or just doesn't really drain very well, roots are a tool to help improve the arrangement of those soil particles so that the water can move and and tilthy. So there's some kind of the physical benefits of having cover crops. In terms of nutrients, we know that most nutrients in the soil that are important for plant growth happen, they occur or they reside in the top few inches of the soil. So here's a nice soil profile where you can see this nice dark color where the roots are growing. There's a lot of organic matter incorporated in the shallow portions of the soil. And that's where a lot of the nitrogen and the phosphorus and potassium and sulfur and all those essential plant nutrients are hanging out. And if we don't have plants that are there, capturing those nutrients, then they risk being, washed down the soil profile and being lost. And that process is called leaching. And so by having those living roots, actively taking up the nutrients and holding those nutrients in that plant biomass, then we can keep those nutrients kind of cycling in the shallow portions of the soil where plants can use it the most. Also with, just with the turnover of plants on an annual cycle, we plant them in the spring, they grow, they produce biomass out of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They lock that carbon dioxide into their tissues, and then they die, or they go dormant for the winter. And that carbon stays in their tissues And then as it starts to decompose, it gets incorporated into the soil to give the soil those nice benefits that we like to see when we have a high organic matter soil. So cover crops are really important for kind of capturing those nutrients and carbon that are in the ecosystem, in the atmosphere and in the soil, and holding them in place so that we don't lose them, and so that they continue to serve us in the soil. I already mentioned biodiversity is a really nice benefit of growing a cover crop, whether you're introducing biodiversity in the form of a plant or a species mix of cover crops, or you're using the cover crops to attract more biodiversity to your site. Cover crops are just a way to expand the characters that reside on the farm. Along with that, we do see some benefits to disease and pest suppression. So sometimes when we attract some of those insects and beneficial microbes in the soil by growing more cover crops, they have the ability to fight off some of the characters that we don't necessarily want to see. So whether it's a pesky insect or some kind of disease in the soil, a lot of that diversity, the effect of the introduced diversity can really help to suppress those bad characters and keep them at manageable levels. And the same thing goes for different weed species. You know, if you have any bare ground in the soil, something is going to want to grow there, and you can either choose to occupy that space with a cover crop that provides benefits, or you can battle the weeds. And so one of the nicest benefits of growing a cover crop is it's sort of like selecting your weeds or choosing your weeds in a way that allows something to be growing there, protecting the soil, providing all those benefits, but also something that you can manage, and it's not going to get way out of hand and produce seed and fill your soil with evil seeds for eternity. I've already mentioned pollinator resources. You know, flowering cover crops are a great option and an added benefit of many cover crops. And if you're a beekeeper or you know beekeepers, or if you just love native bees, we're never going to be unhappy that we're offering some of those, whoops, sorry about that, some of those pollinator resources in the form of pollen and nectar. Economic gain. So this is a tough one. It's really difficult to quantify how some of these things that I've already talked about, some of these benefits translate to savings. And there are research efforts to do that. But it's really difficult. And, you know, this is a natural system. And so it's just not as easy as drawing up a farm enterprise budget and assigning a value to cover crops that you can rely on from year to year to improve your profits or to save money. So that's a difficult one to quantify, but there are lots of hidden benefits in terms of, again, thinking about saving yourself labor for weeding. If you can eliminate the need to weed your beds every week, that could sort of translate to some kind of an economic benefit. So the economic gain can come in lots of different forms that are tricky to quantify in terms of dollar amounts. Okay, some of the risks. As I mentioned, cover crops hold a lot of nutrients and carbon in their biomass. And in order for those nutrients to be released and become available for things that you want to grow, that material needs to decompose. And that can take some time. So especially in our environments where we have a lot of like cool, rainy springs, or just cool soils in general, it takes a bit of time for that material, those dead plant residues to break down, and for the nitrogen and the phosphorus in those tissues to be released and then taken up by another crop. So we call that nutrient tie-up when those nutrients are there, but they're just not yet available to the next crop. And some of the research that I've seen shows that it might take 2 years for some of the cover crop residues to break down enough to actually release some of those nutrients back into the soil and be available for plant uptake. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You just kind of need to be aware that there's a little bit, it's a slow release process, much like adding a compost to the soil as a nutrient source. It takes time for those materials to break down and release the nutrients. Also, it's really important to know that some cover crops can be real water hogs. And so if you don't have an irrigation system, or if you're limited in how much irrigation you can provide, you've got to be really careful about selecting your cover crops, or have a plan for for what's going to happen if they dry out your soil to the point where it's not going to be able to support another crop when you're ready to grow another crop. So a couple things to just keep in mind as you plan, longer term sort of outlook of using cover crops. So I mentioned that cover crops can help suppress weeds, but they can also cause some challenges. If you have a weed management plan in place, um, you definitely don't want to add more weed risk to your system, to your garden. And if some cover crops can be very aggressive growers, they can produce a lot of seeds that can then carry over into the next year, and you'll, you know, have to battle the volunteer cover crops, just like, they would behave just like a weed would. And so you kind of have to think ahead of time about the species that you're planting as cover crops, and maybe evaluate, like, are they prone to becoming a weed problem in the future? And if so, how can I prevent that? Maybe you decide to grow something different than you originally planned, or maybe you have a plan to monitor that cover crop and then kill it off before it starts to produce seed, so that it doesn't become a persistent weed problem. Up here we're very fortunate because we have cold winters, but and so we don't have a lot of things that are going to overwinter and carry over from one year to the next. But there are a few. Vetch is one of them. So there are a few that, it's important to just recognize if they're aggressive and competitive and have they're really winter hardy, they might pose a weed problem moving forward. Pests and diseases also like cover crops as well. So even though we might be attracting, an ecosystem or different predators and competitors for preventing pests and diseases, things like grasshoppers, slugs, some of our biggest pest challenges also like cover crops. And so that's another consideration. If you grow a lot of brassicas for your garden or on your farm, like broccoli, cabbage, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, then you probably don't want to be growing a lot of brassica cover crops, because that can create this sort of disease bridge. And then that defeats the purpose of trying to mix up the rotation. So again, some things that are important to just keep in mind as you start to design a cover crop mix or rotation in your operation. And then much like the economic gain, cover crops can also amount to an economic loss. Seed costs money, your time actually tending to and maintaining a cover crop can also be worth something. And if there is some kind of, devastating year where cover crops don't grow or don't fulfill their purpose in your system, then that could be considered a loss. So so it's something to experiment with, and that's one of the reasons why I always recommend kind of starting small. All right, so I'm going to cruise through just a couple of considerations for you to think about as if you want to start cover cropping. First of all, start by asking yourself, what's the goal? We've been through some benefits and risks. What's the goal? Do you want to break up compaction? Do you want to attract pollinators? Do you want to just diversify the rotation? Maybe prevent some erosion? Because there are different cover crops that fulfill these different roles, and that can kind of help you with your selection of which species to grow. So that's one place to start. What's the goal? Another really important consideration is to think about the timing and the seasonality. So we have a short growing season in most parts of Alaska, starting with a cool spring, and then it might warm up in the summer, and then we have a cool fall. And then the precipitation pattern really varies depending on where you live. And so it's important to think about, what's your window for growing something, and then what species can actually produce some growth during that time, considering the length of time that you have and the types of temperatures and precipitation that you're going to have. So maybe you grow a full season cover crop, which is for the whole season. Maybe you just focus on maybe early season growth or late season growth, or maybe you want something that you plant later in the summer and it overwinters and provides that living cover through the following spring. So again, just kind of thinking about species selection tailored to your growing window. And here are just some examples of different cool season species that perform better in colder temperatures compared to warm season species, and some different plant groups that you can choose from. So we have grasses, we have broadleafs. Within the broadleafs, we have things like brassicas, like canola and mustard. And then we also have legumes, which are kind of a special group that we like for both cash crop reasons, but also they provide a lot of really nice soil benefits in the form of nitrogen contributions to the soil. So a few different things to think about in terms of that seasonality and selecting species that fit into that growing window that you have. Consider the space that you have to grow something. If you think about the different forms that plants can grow, some are like low to the ground and kind of spreading, and some are more viney and like to crawl up poles or neighboring plants. I think there are a lot of different species with different growth forms, different root structures. And so thinking about plant architecture or the shape of the plant and how compatible that might be with the space that you have where you're going to be growing these things. And then, I always have really direct advice about just keep it simple. You can go on to seed store websites and see what kind of cover crop mixes they recommend or offer. And you can design your own. I usually feel like 3 or 4 species is about as many as you need to include, because then you can kind of target lots of different goals, and you can keep the price reasonable, and you're not just overwhelming your system with a lot of competition. So I like to design mixes that are maybe 3, maybe 4 species. And I just recommend starting small. Start on a small piece of land. It's an experiment. Every year is a different opportunity to learn something new about cover crops. And as you get more familiar with how they're growing in your system and what kind of risks and benefits they bring, then you can kind of start to scale up. So I want to just run through a couple of my favorite cover crops. And when I think about what makes a good cover crop, I want something that's like a strong, reliable, hardy grower, but also has low risk to carry over and create some of those weed problems. So peas are one of my absolute favorites. They tend to be fairly reliable growers. When I'm selecting for a cover crop, I usually buy a forage pea variety, but you could use any kind of pea, garden pea, a winter pea, whatever pea you have access to that's fairly cheap. And that's one of the benefits of peas, is that the seeds are usually pretty inexpensive. And maybe you have leftover peas from, your garden in the past, and you don't know that the seed quality is that great. Well, you can throw them out and experiment with them as a cover crop. Peas are also a legume. They contribute nitrogen into the system, and they mix well with other cover crops. And so this photo on the right is a mix of peas and oats. Please ignore the weedy species here at the bottom, but you can see that these peas are kind of trellising and climbing. They're companion oats, and so rigid, tall species are really good companions for peas that have more of that viney climbing growth. But peas are great. Peas produce a lot of biomass and provide a lot of soil benefits. Another great one is buckwheat. So this is another really strong grower early in the season. It has those nice leaves that kind of lay out flat once they start to grow, and they close the canopy to shade the ground and really provide some good weed control. This is also a pollinator host. And when you mow or chop this biomass, or it freezes in the fall, it breaks down really easily and releases those nutrients back into the soil. So we like buckwheat. It's a really strong competitive cover crop. The brassicas are really great. So this includes things like radishes, rapeseed, mustards. These have really strong roots that help to break up soil compaction and create those soil pores that allow air and water into the soil. These are also pretty early maturing in most places in Alaska, and if you have any kind of heat in the summer, then they'll bolt. They'll produce these flowers, which can provide a lot of floral resources to pollinators. And as I mentioned, the big caution with these is to just not use them in beds or areas where you grow a lot of other brassica vegetables like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, all of those. Winter rye is one of my favorite grasses to grow. This is it's a winter annual, so typically it's planted in the fall. It grows a little bit, it's allowed to go dormant through the winter, and then it comes back with force in the spring. It's really cold tolerant. But you can plant it any time of the year. You can plant it in the spring or throughout the summer. It'll grow this nice, thick, grassy mat that you see on the left. It provides really strong weed control, both through competition, and it also has chemicals that it leaks through its roots and tissues to suppress other plants growing in that area. It's very winter hardy, and it won't produce seed. It may put out these kind of seed heads and flower, but it won't actually produce viable seed unless that plant is allowed to overwinter. So if you're only looking for cover for a season, you can plant it in the spring and then mow it, till it in at the end of the season, and you won't have any risk for self-seeding or carryover. Okay, and then the last one is Phacelia. This is a beautiful plant that's a very hardy grower across Alaska, prolific growth, prolific flowering throughout the season. It's a very good pollinator host and strong weed control option. It's a member of the borage plant family, which is a family of plants that are notoriously hairy. And so some farmers have talked about this being a really good anti-slug cover crop. So something about maybe the hairs on the plants irritate the slugs. I haven't observed that, but I'd love to learn more. And if you have experience with Phacelia as a slug deterrent, please let us know. Okay, final tips for management. Follow basic principles as you would with growing any kind of crop. If you order cover crops from a seed provider, they'll provide instructions on how to seed, how deep, what soil temperatures you need, any other tips and tricks. There's lots of resources out there to help you kind of figure out the specific way of what you need to do to the soil and how you tend and maintain this thing as it's growing. In my opinion, cover crops should be really low maintenance, low input. They shouldn't require a lot of labor, a lot of fertilizer, a lot of water. They shouldn't need to be babied. You should be able to plant them, let them do their thing, and walk away. And then just to kind of reiterate, don't sacrifice all the good work you've done to suppress weeds and control weeds on your property in the name of cover crops. You should be able to select cover crops that are compatible with your existing weed management approach. And that might include or should include a termination plan, or how are you going to kill the cover crop when and if you need to. if letting it freeze in the fall isn't a good option. So you can learn a lot more about cover crops. This is a rapid overview of what they are, some of the things that that we think about when we're growing cover crops and evaluating them. You can learn more in a cooperative extension bulletin that we wrote last year. You can scan the QR code here to get the PDF. I believe there's a few hard copies there in person, and you can always reach out to me and ask me questions about cover crops or request a copy of this publication. There's also lots of resources out on the web and through your Soil and Water Conservation District office. And I'll also mention we're anxiously awaiting a web tool developed by the Western Cover Crops Council that a number of us contributed to developing last year. It's scheduled for release this year, 2025. They've had some recent staffing turnover. So this is a tool that will be available online where you can it's like a decision support tool. So you can use the tool, work through the tool to help select and choose which cover crops are appropriate to grow in your region, for your time frame that you're interested in, for the goals that you want to meet, and provide a lot of guidance on how to safely and effectively grow the cover crops. So keep your eye on that resource, and I'll be happy to share it with the Conservation District as soon as I see it go live. So great resources out there to assist you on your cover crop journey. And I want to make sure that there's time for questions. Please reach out to me if you have questions after today. And thank you for your attention. Oh, and I also just want to mention that all of our work, including the work that has led to us, learning more about cover crops in Alaska, is grant funded. We are fully supported on grants, a lot of them federal grants through the Natural Resources Conservation Service and other branches and agencies within the USDA. And none of this would be possible without their support. So thank you to the granting organizations. And with that, I'll pause for some questions.
Thanks, Caley. Yeah, so we have one question in the room, and then those of you on Zoom, if you want to type in the chat or even come off mute and ask your question, feel free to speak. Okay.
In the slide that showed the alfalfa, what is your experience with the alfalfa up there? How does it do as far as growth goes? And where are you sourcing your seed for that?
Sure. So alfalfa is I have a deep love and optimism for alfalfa in Alaska. So for the last 2 years, we have grown a couple different varieties of alfalfa in both Fairbanks and Palmer. It does not do well in South Central. Our winters are open. We don't have a lot of snow insulation, and we see a lot of winter kill. And then in Fairbanks, they get they get much colder winters, but they have a nice insulative layer of snow through the winter that protects the alfalfa from the freeze-thaw cycles. And we've seen survival of vernal, the variety is vernal alfalfa, Rangelander, which is more of a creeping root type, and Denali, which is the variety that's been developed in Alaska in the 70s. So for at least a few years, the alfalfa is doing well in the interior. This summer, we're going to be starting a variety trial of alfalfa, both in Palmer and Fairbanks, for looking at about 32 lines and varieties that are commercially available or experimental for alfalfa, because I have this deep desire to find alfalfa options for growers in Alaska. So where to source the seeds? I would definitely recommend any seed provider who can provide a creeping root type of alfalfa. Or the Plant Material Center has a small quantity of Denali alfalfa seed, which has been, you know, kind of the champion for growing in Alaska. I don't know if they are willing to provide that, but I do think that they're interested in increasing the seed for that Denali variety. So right now, you know, do we have strong recommendations for varieties and sources? No, but I'm on a mission to be able to offer that within the next few years. But you're welcome to reach out and I can give you some more details on the varieties we've tried and how they've done over the years.
We got some questions in the chat for you, Caley. First one would be, what is a good clover to plant? And geographically speaking, since we've got, you know, so many distinct regions in Alaska, climate-wise, and, you know, everything. This question's coming from Pedro Bay, which is over by Lake Iliamna, so kind of in the Bristol Bay headwaters region.
Okay, my favorite clover, so preface, clover seed can be really pricey, and so it's a risky cover crop. My favorite type of clover so far is a berseem clover. So the variety that we've tried, it's actually growing on this slide along with the oats. It's berseem, or sorry, frosty. It's cold tolerant. It grows really prolifically. It looks like alfalfa, has a white flower. But I really like frosty berseem clover, and I can type that in the chat just so that you get the name of that.
Awesome. And then we've got another clover question related to that while you're typing. Is there any, oh no, it's not a clover, it's a cover crop question broadly. Is there any cover crop that outcompetes or stops horsetail or chickweed?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The challenge with both horsetail and chickweed is that they're so persistent, either through, you know, their below ground root parts that give rise to new plants, or the seed in the soil and the mobility of the seed. So these are weeds that are kind of perpetually a challenge to thwart. But I would say, you know, if you have the ability to do a cover crop phase with that cereal rye or winter rye, that's a really good option because it's just ultra competitive. Like I said, it kind of has multiple modes of battling the weeds. It's really competitive in terms of just occupying the space, but it also has those chemicals, those allelochemicals, we call them, that seep out from their roots that help to deter other weeds. And I think, you know, especially with those two weeds, they're going to kind of always be waiting for the opportunity to grow. And so the key with whatever cover crop you use is that it grows fast in the early part of the season. It grows thick and vigorous, and you're just going to kind of rely on that strong competition. But I really like cereal rye for those really difficult weedy problems. Mm-hmm.
And then raise your hand if you have anything in the room here, but we have another one on the chat. Does buckwheat need a 50-degree plus temperature to germinate?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, 50 degrees sounds pretty safe, but most of our cover crops, you know, we're watching in the spring, we're watching the soil temperatures, and once they're 40 degrees, we're planting. So, so even though it's kind of more of a warm season, we find that it's really pretty competitive at germinating early in the spring. You know, we're typically planting in Palmer, which is cooler than our interior sites. We're planting last week of May, first part of June. Our soil temperatures are usually around 40 at that time. So, you know, you can put the seed out when it's a little cooler, and as soon as that seed is ready to go, it'll go. So that could very well be at a lower temperature than 50 degrees.
Question for you. I got a few. But regarding those grasses, grass roots, you know, they're real clumpy, they're real thick, they're like a mat. And they're tough to plant into, and grasses like to come back. So do you have to till the grass ones completely into the soil in order to make sure that they don't just regrow, or to make it nice soil?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I think of the grasses in terms of like this scale from being like wimps to like really tough grasses. And I would say oats are like the wimpiest. And you can mow them and kind of like chop up the leaves and stems and leave them on the surface and they'll kind of degrade. And their roots are usually not, the roots are also going to kind of degrade. That's the grass that's most likely to kind of break down without too much additional effort. But then as you get into like we go from oats to wheat is a little bit more hardy and a little bit more tough tissue to break down. And then barley is a little bit more difficult. And that rye is like the hardest. So it's really like really strong tissue. It likes to hang around, and those roots can get really well established and create those kind of root balls, like you said. So depending on, which grass you're growing, it never hurts to mow the stuff in the fall or in the late part of the season and try to chop up as much of that above ground material as possible. And then if you can, if you want to till it a little bit to kind of start to break up those root mats, you should do that at least once in the fall to expose those roots to the cold. And then, and especially in the case of that rye, since it's so hardy, it likes to overwinter. You want to expose those roots to the elements, and that should really help. And then, to kind of kill them off. And then in the spring, you'll do a little bit more cultivation and tillage to incorporate them and break them up. So take a look, as those plants are growing, if they're starting to get like really tough and rigid, and you feel like the roots are like really strong and going to kind of cause a problem, then that's time to mow it, and maybe leave a little bit of residue on the surface to protect the soil. But you definitely want to keep tabs on how persistent that biomass is going to be, and try to avoid creating a headache with dealing with those materials later in the year. Mm-hmm.
And there's another question in the chat. Alex in Homer says we have lots of Timothy on our property. Do you have any experience with it as a cover crop? And would it contribute to good soil health?
I don't see Timothy being used as a cover crop, and I don't have experience growing it as a cover crop. I will say it's great for soil health. Grasses are kind of like really good. Grasses have those nice fibrous root systems. Even the annuals and the perennials, they have lots of roots that do a really good job of feeding the soil and feeding the microbes. Those fine roots die and turn over really regularly, so they're always releasing a lot of goodness to the soil. So yeah, it's a great option for soil health. And if that's what you have, give it a try. And that's a really good point. Like, you don't have to go crazy buying specialty cover crop seed. If you have seed, like I said, old vegetable seeds or old flower seeds that aren't maybe don't have like the best germination rate or are kind of getting old, just you can use those. We call those the shop floor mix. It's like where you got throw into a bed and if you have Timothy available to you or it's already growing on your property, um, and you call it a cover crop, and yeah, it's doing good for the soil.
And then, are there any invasive species that we should avoid using as cover crops?
Yeah, I really like to avoid the vetches, like I said, common vetch, hairy vetch, certainly bird vetch. We already have enough vetch in Alaska, and they tend to be a little bit aggressive. And especially in, the more mild parts of the state where the winters might not be as harsh to keep them in check. I'm not a big fan of the sweet clovers, yellow and white sweet clover. We see those along the roadsides. They've been used intentionally in a lot of places, and I just think there are better options that don't pose that invasive risk.
And they are high on the invasive species list,
Yeah.
both the bird vetch and the white sweet clover.
Yep, I would avoid both of those. Aside from that, I think our winters up to this point have been pretty good at kind of keeping a lot of the the traditional cover crop species in check.
You can take a look at the invasive species list for Alaska, the invasive plants list for Alaska, through either, the Division of Agriculture kind of holds the master list, but the Kenai Peninsula Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, or KP-SISMA for the acronym, their website has the list, and so you can make sure you're not planting something that's on it. And that website is kenaiinvasives.org.
Are there ways to incorporate cover crops into the soil or plant into an area that they've been without using tillage or using minimum tillage?
Yeah, so if it's possible to grow a cover crop and not use tillage to kill it or to incorporate it. And so what I would recommend, and I like to do this in my own garden, is grow a cover crop. Like I said, you kind of have to keep an eye on it to make sure that it's not becoming too mature, too woody, or too bulky. Because we like that fresh green material. That's what does the most good for our soil. So when it gets to that point, you can mow it. Maybe you have to mow it once or twice during the season, but you keep the above ground biomass. You remove it or mow it and kill the cover crop that way. And then you allow it to kind of rest and do the freeze thaw business over the winter, kind of start to degrade and decompose. And then depending on what you're planting, you don't necessarily need to till in the spring. What you can do if you have transplants is just clear a small area and then dig a little hole and put your transplant in. If you're direct seeding, you can clear, a furrow, clear the residue away, make a little furrow with a hoe, and then drop your seed in and kind of just prepare the seed bed right where you're planting instead of tilling the entire bed. Now, this gets much more complicated as you scale up in size. And so there are, at the large scale, we're talking like commodity scale. Grain farmers have specific tools to kind of essentially do the exact same thing, where they're just preparing a strip in the cover residue to plant their seed. But you can simulate that with manual hand tools at a smaller scale. Now, the caveat to that is that when you have all of that material on the soil surface, it collects a lot of water. It keeps the soil colder into the spring. So the big challenge is like being patient and waiting for that soil to warm up and thaw and dry out in the spring, when you feel like you're like really antsy to get the seeds and the transplants in the ground. So, yeah, so there are ways. It's like precision seed bed prep at a very small scale. That's hyper local for the specific plants that you're growing in that residue.
A related question then, Kaylee. So down here in Homer, we had cover crop trials as part of a statewide trial system. And we had kind of a cover crop guru like yourself named Jay Fuhrer come down. And something that I took away from that conversation was that he recommended people only grow cover crops for 8 weeks. And that during those 8 weeks, the plant, as its roots are developing, they're actually exuding sugars into the soil. So they're called exudates, right? So they're putting them out. But then as they get bigger and want to go to seed or flower or whatever they're going to do with themselves, they suck it back up. So would you concur with that? Or have any, some of these we're talking about letting go the full maturity cycle.
Yeah, and I think that the duration that you allow a cover crop to grow is really different depending on what you're growing, which species you're growing, and also it varies wildly across the state. We have some, the way these plants grow is really different across our different regions because the climate is so different as we travel across the state. So I agree that the most benefit, that much of the benefit comes from the early phases of growth, like before the plant starts to produce a lot of flowers and put its resources into producing seed. Luckily, a lot of the warm season species just don't have enough heat in our summers to ever like graduate from that growth, like vegetative growth stage into the reproductive stage. And so they just keep like they stay in the as teenagers for their entire life and in the season. And that's great for producing a lot of biomass and roots. And then also just think about as a plant matures, it's getting much bigger, heavier, and in order to support that the weight of putting on seeds and big flowers and showy flowers, the roots actually also change. They have to, early in the plant's growth, they're like these nice, like supple, absorptive structures that take up a lot of nutrients and they explore the soil, but as the plant grows big and it needs a lot more structural support, then the root system turns into something that's more structurally supportive. And so it's more like, more woody material below ground as well. And that takes more time to decompose. And the function of the roots kind of shifts from being that early stage of growth where it's putting a lot of those exudates into the soil and feeding the soil, and then it stops doing that, and then it provides more structural support for the plant. Like think about a tree root, it's not necessarily feeding the soil, it's really providing support for that big, huge tree. So yeah, so I would agree, a lot of the benefit comes during those vegetative growth stages when the plant is producing green, new leaves and not focusing most of its resources on producing seeds. So excellent consideration for which species you want to select and then being able to observe them in your location from one season to the next.
Charlie, you have a question?
Yeah, so I was just looking at your pictures and thinking about cover crops without tilling. And I wondered, because I don't have a tiller, I wondered about if you would advise like putting in, I've got a lot of chipped alder stems, that I've chipped up from dead stuff. And I just wonder, because you've got so much green there, would you recommend putting some carbon in with that?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think, I like the idea. I like how you're thinking about it, almost like this compost idea. You have the green materials and you have the brown materials, which would be your alder chips. And for a compost pile, that's really important to mix the two because the chips provide some energy for the microbes, but also they aerate and keep that material kind of fluffy. I don't know that same effect necessarily happens in a bed, where you have the need for more rapid nutrient release. So we like the green material just because it doesn't stick around so long. And if you do incorporate some of those brown materials in place to mingle with some of the green materials, then it's just gonna kind of delay some of that nutrient release over time to your plants. So I think you could try it. I think if you have a lot of that material and you're using the alder to kind of build your soil health in different ways, maybe add some fluffiness and some aeration. You could try it in an area. You could combine it with some cover crops, do a little test. I'd be curious to see if you see any kind of nutrient deficiency evolve from the addition of those alder chips, or if it's overall not necessarily interfering with your nutrient cycling.
Okay, thanks, yeah. I often if I have to move a bed or rebuild a bed, I'll scatter, I'll put alder chip in there, and I'll also sprinkle it with some blood meal before I cover it. And I feel like I've had pretty good result with it. Also, the dried chip seems to hold moisture pretty well, and it seems to promote I don't know what they're called, those little white filaments sometimes that you see in the soil.
Mycorrhizal.
Yeah,
Yeah, that sounds like a great, I mean, it sounds like a great way to start building a bed and supplementing it. Yeah,
okay.
if it's working for you, go for it. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking that, you know, I haven't tried it with cover crops because I haven't tried cover cropping, but I'd like to try it instead of doing additions, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
We've got another question in the chat box here. Have you worked with living walkways between market garden rows? Would you have a recommendation for a cover crop to use for this type of usage?
Yeah, I haven't worked with this directly, but I aspire to this. And I think, you know, there's so much opportunity in market gardens across the state to have living walkways. Um, I've seen it effectively done with turf grasses. I know, you know, which can be a little aggressive and encroach into beds. But also with clovers, whether it's a white clover or some I'm sorry, I'm forgetting some of the other small blossom clovers, like a medic, some different clover mixes that folks have used that can be pretty persistent and hold the ground in place. You know, the nice thing about the clovers is that they are theoretically contributing some nitrogen into the system, and that can benefit the beds in the adjacent beds. I'm trying to think if there's anything offhand that I could recommend, but I that's what I can tell you with confidence is that some of those low-lying creeping turf grass type species, as well as maybe mixed in with some clovers. And I've seen that in peony farms, vineyards, orchards, and a few market gardens. So those would be, yeah, some of the standard recommendations, I believe.
Haley, someone tried using the QR code that you provided, but when they did, it says, quote, "You need to choose a plan to reactivate this QR code."
Okay.
I tracked down the link already and I put it in the chat for people.
Thanks, Monica. I guess I need to reactivate my QR code plan. Thanks for that. Heads up. Apologies, everybody.
We're about to wrap up the Q&A. Are there any last burning questions in the room or on the Zoom?
What was the last plant with the purple flower that you showed?
Oh yeah, so that's Phacelia. I'll type that into the chat. It's Phacelia. Lots of varieties out there. I believe you can even buy some in Alaska from Found Root and probably a few other seed providers. It's a beautiful plant. I've really enjoyed watching that one grow.
Thanks.